On January 15th, 1974, a quiet Wichita neighborhood woke to a nightmare that would haunt the city for decades. Inside a modest family home, 4 members of the Otero family had been brutally murdered. There was no obvious motive, no robbery, no personal connection that investigators could immediately identify. The crime scene was unlike anything many local officers had ever encountered. It was organized, deliberate, and deeply disturbing. As detectives searched for answers, they had no way of knowing they were standing at the beginning of one of the longest and most terrifying serial murder investigations in American history. For the next 31 years, the man responsible would hide in plain sight. He would raise a family, attend church, work regular jobs, and blend seamlessly into his community. Yet behind the ordinary exterior lived a predator driven by fantasies of control, domination, and murder. He didn't just kill for satisfaction. He wanted recognition. He wanted fear. And most of all, he wanted a name. And when he finally chose one for himself, the world would never forget it. This is the story of Dennis Rader, the man who called himself BTK. Welcome back to Postmortem. Today, we're beginning the first installment of our 3-part series on one of America's most infamous serial killers, Dennis Rader, better known as BTK. Over the next 3 episodes, we'll examine how an ordinary-looking man managed to terrorize Wichita, Kansas for decades while living what appeared to be a completely normal life. In this first chapter, we're going back to the beginning. We'll explore Rader's early years, the disturbing fantasies that would shape his future crimes, and the murders that introduced Wichita to a killer unlike any they had ever seen before. This is not just the story of how BTK started killing. It's a story of how a monster was created, how he learned to hide behind a mask of normalcy, and how an entire city became trapped in the shadow of his violence. So lock your doors, turn on a light, and settle in. Let's get started. To understand the fear BTK would eventually create, we first need to understand the city he chose as his hunting grounds. In the early 1970s, Wichita, Kansas was a growing Midwestern city known for its strong sense of community and its ties to the aviation industry. Neighborhoods were filled with young families, children played outside until the streetlights came on, and many residents felt comfortable leaving their doors unlocked. Like much of America, Wichita was not immune to crime, but violent crimes of the kind that would soon grip the city were relatively rare. It was the kind of place where people know their neighbors, attended church together, and believed that terrible things happened somewhere else. The city itself was experiencing growth and change. New housing developments were expanding into suburban areas, bringing thousands of families seeking stability and opportunity. Schools were full, local businesses were thriving, and many residents viewed Wichita as a safe place to raise children. For law enforcement, most investigations involved property crimes, domestic disputes, and offenses that followed familiar patterns. The idea that a calculating serial killer could be living among them was not something most people seriously considered. But while Wichita appeared peaceful on the surface, Dennis Rader was already living within the community, long before his name became known to the public. He was quietly nurturing violent fantasies that would eventually erupt into reality. To neighbors and acquaintances, he appeared ordinary. He attended school, held jobs, and blended into an everyday life. Yet beneath that outward appearance, he was developing an obsession with power, control, and domination that would shape the course of his life. One of the most unsettling aspects of the BTK case is how completely ordinary the setting seemed before the murders began. There was no dramatic warning signs visible to the public, no widespread panic, no reason for families to believe that a predator was studying their neighborhoods, watching potential victims, and fantasizing about the crimes he hoped to commit. The danger was invisible, hiding behind the routines of daily life. When serial killers are discussed in popular culture, there's often an assumption that they stand out from everyone around them, that there must have been something obviously sinister about them. The reality is often far more disturbing. Many are able to move through society unnoticed because they understand how to appear normal. Dennis Rader would become one of the most striking examples of this phenomenon. He wasn't a drifter passing through town. He wasn't a stranger lurking on the edges of society. He was part of the community itself. As 1974 approached, Wichita residents had no idea that their sense of security was about to be shattered. Within weeks, a single crime scene would transform the city forever, launch one of the largest investigations in Kansas history, and introduce the world to a killer who would spend decades chasing both victims and notoriety. But before the murders, before the letters, and before the name BTK became known, there was simply Dennis Rader, a young man whose darkest fantasies were becoming impossible to contain. And to understand how those fantasies developed, we need to go back even further to the beginning of Dennis Rader's life. Dennis Rader was born on March 9th, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and was raised in Wichita along with his three younger brothers. By most outward appearances, his childhood seemed fairly ordinary. His parents worked hard, the family lived a typical middle-class life, and there was little in his early years that would have caused neighbors or teachers to predict the horrors that would eventually unfold. Like many serial killers, Rader would later describe himself as feeling different from others from a young age. Though whether those feelings were the cause of his future crimes or simply part of the story he later constructed about himself remains a subject of debate. As a child, Rader often found himself alone. Both of his parents worked long hours, leaving him with a significant amount of unsupervised time. In later interviews and writings, he claimed that he felt neglected and overlooked. While many children experience loneliness without developing violent tendencies, Rader frequently pointed to these feelings as an important part of his personal history. Investigators and psychologists have noted that serial killers often attempt to explain their actions by highlighting difficult experiences from childhood. But there is no evidence that Rader suffered the kind of severe abuse commonly associated with some of the other violent offenders. What does stand out in accounts of his early years is the emergence of disturbing fantasies. Rader later admitted that he became fascinated by images involving bondage, helplessness, and control at a young age. He described becoming fixated on stories in magazines and newspapers that involved women being restrained or placed in dangerous situations. These fantasies were not fleeting curiosities. Over time, they became deeply ingrained and increasingly elaborate, serving as a foundation for the violent thoughts that would consume him throughout adulthood. Another troubling aspect of Rader's childhood involves allegations of animal cruelty. While details vary depending on the source, Rader himself acknowledged harming animals and deriving a sense of power from controlling weaker creatures. Animal cruelty is often discussed as a potential warning sign in the backgrounds of violent offenders, though it is important to note that not every child who harms animals grows up to commit violent crimes. In Rader's case, however, it formed part of a broader pattern that involved voyeuristic behavior, sadistic fantasies, and increasing desire to dominate others. As he entered adolescence, those fantasies continued to evolve. While most teenagers were navigating friendships, sports, or first relationships, Rader was retreating deeper into a private world of imagination. He later described creating detailed scenarios in which he stalked, restrained, and controlled victims. These fantasies became a source of excitement and escape, and they gradually blurred the line between imagination and reality. Rather than seeking help or finding healthy outlets, he nurtured these thoughts in secret, allowing them to grow stronger with time. After graduating high school, he briefly attended college before serving in the United States Air Force. He spent several years in the military, including time stationed overseas. To those around him, he appeared disciplined and capable. Yet the fantasies that had begun in childhood never disappeared. They traveled with him, growing more detailed and more compulsive. By the time he returned to civilian life in the early 1970s, the violent desires that had once existed only in his imagination were becoming increasingly difficult to suppress. What makes Dennis Rader's story so disturbing is that there was no dramatic transformation from normal citizen to serial killer. Instead, his progression appears to have been gradual. Years of fantasies, obsession, and secret behavior slowly built towards something far more dangerous. While the people around him saw an ordinary young man trying to build a future, Rader was cultivating a hidden identity that would eventually emerge in devastating fashion. By the early 1970s, he was married, starting a family, and attempting to establish a normal life. But beneath that facade, the fantasies that had been growing since childhood were reaching a breaking point. Soon, imagination would no longer be enough. Dennis Rader wanted more than fantasy, he wanted reality, and before long, he would begin searching for his first victim. In the early 1970s, Dennis Rader was living what many people would have considered a stable and successful life. He was married to his wife, Paula, and was working toward building a future for his growing family. To outsiders, he appeared to be settling into adulthood like countless other young men of his generation. Yet behind closed doors, Rader was fighting a battle that few people knew existed. The violent fantasies that had taken root during childhood had not faded with age. Instead, they had become more detailed, more obsessive, and far more dangerous. Unlike impulsive killers who act in moments of rage or desperation, Rader's crimes were born from years of fantasy. He later described spending countless hours imagining scenarios in which he stalked, captured, restrained, and ultimately controlled his victims. These fantasies were not random. They followed patterns and rituals. They became increasingly important to him. In his mind, he was creating elaborate stories in which he held complete control over another human being. The victims were not viewed as people with families, dreams, and lives of their own. They were characters in the private world he had constructed for himself. As those fantasies intensified, Rader began taking steps that moved them closer to reality. He started secretly watching women and studying potential victims. He drove through neighborhoods, observed daily routines, and paid attention to homes that seemed vulnerable. These activities allowed him to feed his fantasies while remaining undetected. Each act of surveillance gave him a sense of excitement and control, reinforcing the desires that had been building for years. Rader would later refer to potential victims as projects, a term that reveals how detached he had become from the humanity of the people he targeted. Rather than seeing individuals, he saw opportunities. He studied their habits, evaluated their surroundings, and imagined how he might carry out an attack. This process could continue for days, weeks, or even months before he decides. The planning itself became part of the gratification he sought. One of the most chilling parts of Rader's psychology was his belief that he was leading two completely separate lives. On one side was Dennis Rader, the husband, father, employee, and neighbor. And on the other side was the dark persona that existed within his fantasies. He often spoke about feelings as though he carried a hidden force inside him, something he later referred to as Factor X. While psychologists reject the idea of a mysterious force compelling people to commit murder, the term offers insight into how Rader viewed himself. It allowed him to separate his crimes from the image he wanted the world to see. As time passed, fantasy alone was no longer enough. The excitement he once gained from imagining violence began to lose its effectiveness. This escalation is common among serial offenders. Behaviors that once provided satisfaction eventually stop producing the same emotional response, leading the offender to seek more intense experiences. For Rader, that meant moving beyond voyeurism and planning. He wanted to experience the control he had been imagining for years. In the months leading up to January 1974, he began actively searching for victims. He spent time driving through neighborhoods, looking for homes that appeared accessible and occupants who seemed vulnerable. He was no longer simply dreaming about murder. He was preparing for it. Every observation, every fantasy, and every rehearsal was bringing him closer to a point of no return. Then, in January of 1974, Dennis Rader found the family he believed would fulfill the fantasies he had spent years nurturing. He selected them almost at random, yet the consequences of that decision would change countless lives forever. The family was named Otero, and on a cold winter morning, their home would become the site of one of the most infamous crimes in American history. On the morning of January 15th, 1974, Dennis Rader put years of fantasy into action. The target he had chosen was the Otero family. They lived in a modest home on North Edgemore Street in Wichita. Joseph Otero was a 38-year-old Air Force veteran. His wife Julie was 33, and together they were raising 5 children. There was nothing about the family that connected them to Rader. They had never met him, never crossed paths with him, and had no reason to believe they were being watched. And to Dennis, they were simply what he later referred to as a project. In the days leading up to the attack, he had observed the family and developed a plan. He believed the home would contain only a woman and possibly a child. What he didn't anticipate was finding multiple family members inside. And for most criminals, that unexpected complication would have been enough reason to abandon the plan. Instead, Rader continued. Armed with a handgun and materials he intended to use for restraints, he approached the home and forced his way inside. Once inside, he confronted Joseph, Julie, and 2 of their children, 11-year-old Josephine and 9-year-old Joseph Jr. Rader claimed he was a wanted criminal who needed money, food, and a vehicle. The story was a lie designed to gain compliance while he established control over the family. He ordered them into a bedroom and began binding them one by one. Although terrified, the family attempted to cooperate, likely believing that compliance would help them survive the ordeal. What followed was a prolonged and horrifying attack. Rader systematically strangled each victim, moving between family members as he tightened and adjusted bindings. The murders were not quick acts of violence. They reflected the very fantasies he had spent years developing. Fantasies centered on domination, helplessness, and control. Investigators would later note that the crime scene displayed a level of organization and planning rarely seen in typical homicides. Joseph and Julie fought desperately to protect their children, but there was little they could do against an armed intruder who had already seized control of the situation. One by one, the family members were killed. The final victim was Josephine, whose death would become one of the most heartbreaking parts of this case. After murdering the family, Rader spent additional time inside the home. He moved through the residence, collecting items, and absorbed the reality of what he had done. Rather than feeling remorse, he experienced the fulfillment of fantasies he had nurtured for years. The crime was discovered later that day when one of the children returned home from school and found something terribly wrong. Soon police officers flooded the neighborhood. Detectives were immediately confronted with a scene unlike anything they had encountered before. 4 family members had been murdered inside their own home, yet there was no clear motive. Robbery did not appear to explain the killings, and there was no obvious personal connection. Investigators were left searching for answers, while an entire community struggled to comprehend the brutality of what had just occurred. News of the murder spread rapidly throughout Wichita. Residents who had once felt secure began locking doors and checking windows. Parents worried about their children. Neighbors looked at one another with suspicion. The realization that an unknown killer had entered a family home and murdered 4 people in broad daylight shattered their sense of safety. For Dennis Rader, however, the murders represented something entirely different. They were not an ending, they were a beginning. That attack had given him exactly what he had been seeking: the power, control, and excitement he had fantasized about for years. Instead of satisfying his urges, the murders intensified them. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. At the time, investigators believed they were hunting a dangerous killer responsible for a single horrific crime. What they didn't know was that the man who they were searching for had already begun thinking about future victims, and within months he would strike again. More importantly, he would begin craving something almost as much as murder itself: recognition. He wanted the world to know a predator was stalking Wichita, and soon he would find a way to introduce himself. In the months following the Otero family murders, Wichita remained on edge. Detectives worked tirelessly to identify a suspect, chasing leads and conducting interviews, but the investigation produced few answers. The killer had seemingly appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly. For the public, the uncertainty was terrifying. Families began taking precautions they had never considered before. Doors that had once been left unlocked were now secured. Neighbors became more watchful. Yet despite the fear spreading through the city, the person responsible was quietly returning to his normal routine. Dennis Rader went back to work, spent time with his family, and blended into everyday life. On the surface, nothing appeared unusual, but internally, he was reliving the murders over and over again. He later admitted that he revisited the events in his mind repeatedly, drawing satisfaction from the memories and using them to fuel new fantasies. Rather than feeling guilt or remorse, he felt empowered. The murders had given him exactly what he wanted, but they had also awakened a new desire, one that would become a defining characteristic of the BTK case. Rader wanted recognition. Many serial killers attempt to avoid attention at all costs. They fear identification and capture. But Dennis Rader was different. While he certainly didn't want to be arrested, he desperately wanted acknowledgement. He wanted law enforcement, the media, and the public to understand that the murders were not random acts of violence. He wanted credit. He wanted fear. And most of all, he wanted to control the narrative surrounding his crimes. That need for recognition became even stronger after he committed additional murders. As the months passed, Rader grew frustrated that the public seemed unaware that a serial killer was operating in Wichita. He believed his crimes should receive more attention. In his mind, he wasn't simply committing murders, he was creating a legacy. The lack of public recognition felt like an insult to his inflated sense of importance. Then, in 1974, he decided to take matters into his own hands. Rader began communicating with the media and law enforcement through anonymous letters. These communications contained details that only the killer would know, allowing investigators to confirm their authenticity. The letters were carefully crafted to ensure that his crimes would be linked together and attributed to a single offender. They also provided a glimpse into the ego that would define him for decades. Rader wasn't content with remaining an unknown killer. He wanted an identity. In one of his communications, he proposed several possible nicknames for himself. Among them were variations that never caught on. But one stood out from the rest. It was simple, direct, and horrifyingly descriptive. The name summarized the method that existed at the core of his fantasies and his crimes. Bind, torture, kill. BTK. With those 3 words, Dennis Rader transformed himself from an unknown murderer into a self-created monster. The nickname would dominate headlines, terrify Wichita residents, and eventually become one of the most recognizable labels. It was exactly what he wanted, a brand that would ensure people remembered him. For investigators, the letters were both a blessing and a curse. They provided valuable information about the killer's mindset and confirmed the multiple crimes were connected. At the same time, they revealed a disturbing truth. BTK wasn't simply killing for personal gratification. He was performing. Every communication was designed to manipulate public perception, taunt law enforcement, and place himself at the center of the story. As the city struggled to understand this emerging threat, Dennis Rader was already planning his next move. The murders had not satisfied him. The attention had not satisfied him. Nothing seemed capable of filling the void created by years of violent fantasies and obsession. His appetite for control continued to grow, and so did the danger he posed. In the years ahead, BTK would claim more victims, refine his methods, and deepen the fear gripping Wichita. He would build a family, become active in his community, and maintain the appearance of an ordinary citizen while carrying out a secret life as a serial killer. The contrast between these 2 identities would make his case one of the most chilling. But that double life and the murders that followed is where our story continues. Next time on Postmortem, we'll examine how Dennis Rader perfected the art of hiding in plain sight, how he selected and stalked his victims, and how BTK evolved from an unknown killer into the predator who would terrorize Wichita for decades. For now, head on over to Patreon and take this episode's poll. And until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and stay vigilant.